High tariffs, often shrouded in political rhetoric, have historically disrupted global trade by increasing costs and reducing the flow of goods, as seen in the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, which deepened the Great Depression. For the state imposing them, such as the United States under Trump's administration, tariffs can temporarily boost domestic industries, but often lead to retaliatory measures and strained diplomatic relations, exemplified by China's counter-tariffs on U.S. agricultural products. The stock market reacts volatilely to tariff announcements, with sectors like automobiles and technology experiencing significant drops as investors anticipate reduced profits and economic uncertainty. Tariffs, essentially taxes on imported goods, have been a cornerstone of trade policy since ancient times, serving both as a source of government revenue and a tool to protect nascent industries. Historically, tariffs were crucial in funding the U.S. federal government before the introduction of income tax, with the Tariff of 1789 being one of the first acts of Congress. However, their role has evolved, often becoming a double-edged sword that can either foster domestic growth or incite trade wars, as evidenced by the chicken tax of 1963, which surprisingly still affects the price of light trucks today. A tariff is a tax levied on imported or, less commonly, exported goods designed to raise revenue or protect domestic industries from foreign competition. The primary types include ad valorem tariffs, which are a percentage of the value of the goods, and specific tariffs, which are a fixed fee per unit, both of which can be manipulated to target specific industries or countries. Additionally, protective tariffs aim to shield local businesses, while revenue tariffs focus on generating income, with the latter being more prevalent in developing economies. High tariffs have a storied past, with the Corn Laws in 19th century Britain serving as a prime example, where protectionist policies initially aimed at supporting domestic agriculture led to widespread famine and social unrest, ultimately forcing their repeal. Similarly, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff of 1930, intended to protect U.S. farmers, inadvertently escalated into a global trade war, exacerbating the Great Depression and highlighting the perilous ripple effects of isolationist trade policies. These historical lessons underscore the delicate balance between protectionism and economic stability, revealing that high tariffs often yield unforeseen and far-reaching consequences. In ancient civilizations, early forms of tariffs, often called tolls or customs duties, were imposed on goods transported along trade routes, such as the Silk Road, where merchants faced levies at various checkpoints, impacting the cost and flow of exotic goods. For instance, the Roman Empire levied the portorium, a tax on imports and exports, which funded infrastructure but also led to smuggling and corruption, as vividly depicted in the tales of Marcus Licinius Crassus, who amassed wealth through such systems. These ancient practices not only shaped trade dynamics, but also laid the groundwork for modern tariff systems, illustrating the enduring human penchant for taxing commerce. During the mercantilist era, spanning the 16th to 18th centuries, European powers like Britain and France heavily relied on tariffs to amass wealth by controlling trade and protecting domestic industries, often at the expense of their colonies. However, this approach led to unexpected consequences, such as the Boston Tea Party of 1773, where American colonists protested against the Tea Act, a tariff measure that ultimately fueled the American Revolution. This period starkly illustrates how mercantilist tariffs, while intended to strengthen empires, could inadvertently sow the seeds of rebellion and economic independence. In the nascent United States, tariffs were pivotal in funding the federal government and fostering industrial growth, with the Tariff of 1816 marking the first protective tariff to shield American manufacturers from British competition post-war of 1812. However, this protectionism sparked fierce political battles, most notably the nullification crisis of 1832, where South Carolina threatened secession over the Tariff of Abominations, revealing deep regional divides over trade policy. These early tariff debates not only shaped the nation's economic trajectory, but also foreshadowed the sectional tensions that would later erupt into the Civil War. Beyond generating revenue, governments impose high tariffs to achieve a range of objectives, including protecting infant industries, preserving national security, and even exerting political leverage over trading partners. For instance, the U.S. has historically used tariffs to safeguard strategic sectors like steel production, but these measures can also serve as bargaining chips in broader geopolitical negotiations, as seen in the Trump administration's trade disputes with China. Moreover, tariffs can be wielded to appease domestic constituencies or punish perceived unfair trade practices, often masking underlying economic anxieties or strategic ambitions. Protectionism via tariffs aims to shield domestic industries by making imported goods more expensive, thereby encouraging consumers to buy locally produced items, as exemplified by India's post-independence policies to nurture its manufacturing sector. However, this strategy can backfire, as seen in the U.S. automotive industry during the 1980s, where tariffs on Japanese cars led to higher prices and reduced competition, ultimately stifling innovation and consumer choice. Such outcomes highlight the delicate balance between protection and stagnation, where tariffs intended to foster growth can inadvertently entrench inefficiency and complacency. Tariffs justified on national security grounds often target industries deemed critical for defense, such as steel and aluminum, as invoked by the U.S. under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act during the Trump administration. However, these claims are not always substantiated, as evidenced by the WTO ruling against the U.S. in 2019, which found that the tariffs on steel and aluminum from allies like Canada and the EU were not genuinely linked to national security threats. This misuse of the national security exception underscores the potential for tariffs to be wielded as a pretext for protectionism, blurring the lines between genuine defense concerns and economic nationalism. In modern economies, high tariffs are rarely a significant source of government revenue, dwarfed by income taxes, sales taxes, and other levies, with the U.S. collecting only about 2% of its federal revenue from tariffs in recent years. This stands in stark contrast to historical examples, such as the early United States, where tariffs accounted for over 90% of federal income before the Civil War, funding everything from infrastructure to military expenditures. The shift reflects broader economic changes, where diversified tax bases and global trade agreements have diminished the fiscal importance of tariffs, rendering them more a tool of policy than a fiscal necessity. The Trump administration's tariff saga began in early 2018 with the imposition of steel and aluminum tariffs, citing national security concerns, which quickly escalated into a broader trade war with China, involving tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of goods. Subsequent rounds targeted specific sectors, including automobiles and technology, with the U.S. and China exchanging retaliatory measures, while also imposing tariffs on allies like Canada and the EU, leading to a complex web of trade disputes. This aggressive tariff strategy, unprecedented in modern times, aimed to reshape global trade dynamics, but also sparked widespread economic uncertainty and diplomatic tensions. The very first tariffs imposed by the Trump administration in 2018 were on solar panels and washing machines in January, followed by the more contentious steel and aluminum tariffs in March, which targeted a wide range of countries under the guise of national security. These initial volleys provoked immediate and unexpected reactions, including Canada's swift retaliation with tariffs on U.S. goods like whiskey and maple syrup, and China's countermeasures on U.S. agricultural products, highlighting the rapid escalation of trade tensions. Domestically, the tariffs led to a surge in steel prices, benefiting producers but straining manufacturers reliant on imported materials, illustrating the complex interplay of winners and losers in trade policy. Steel and aluminum were targeted first because they are foundational to numerous industries, from construction to automotive, and the Trump administration argued that reliance on foreign imports posed a national security risk. However, the tariffs led to immediate supply chain disruptions, with companies like Harley-Davidson citing increased costs as a reason for moving production overseas, and small businesses, such as a nail manufacturer in Missouri, facing layoffs due to soaring material prices. These anecdotes underscore the ripple effects of tariffs, where intended protections for one sector can inadvertently harm others, revealing the intricate dependencies within global supply chains. The initial steel and aluminum tariffs hit a broad spectrum of countries, including traditional allies like Canada, Mexico, and the European Union, alongside adversaries like China, under the blanket justification of national security. This move led to surprising diplomatic fallout, with Canada and the EU denouncing the tariffs as unjustified and imposing retaliatory measures, while Mexico accelerated negotiations for a revised NAFTA, ultimately leading to the USMCA. The tariffs strained long-standing alliances, prompting questions about the reliability of U.S. trade policy and highlighting the geopolitical risks of unilateral trade actions. The tariff conflict with China kicked off in March 2018 when the U.S., under Trump, slapped steel and aluminum tariffs on imports, only to spiral into chaos by July when $50 billion worth of Chinese goods got hit, exposing a shadowy trade war hidden behind unfair practices claims. China struck back with its own tariffs on U.S. goods, and by September 2018, the U.S. upped the ante with tariffs on $200 billion more of Chinese imports, dragging everything from tech to farm produce into the fray. This relentless escalation stretched into 2019, revealing a global conspiracy of economic tit-for-tat that no one saw coming. The official justification for hammering Chinese goods with tariffs came via Section 301 of the Trade Act, where the U.S. accused China of intellectual property theft and forcing tech transfers, claims whispered in dark corridors as a mask for deeper motives. Dig beneath the surface, and you'll find counterarguments. Some insiders argue it was a power play to squeeze China into trade concessions, while others whisper the tariffs were a desperate shield against China's rising economic dominance, not just IP gripes. Critics also point to a hidden cost. U.S. consumers and businesses got burned, a secret fallout buried under the patriotic rhetoric. The U.S.-China tariff war timeline reads like a thriller. July 2018 saw the U.S. unleash tariffs on $50 billion of Chinese goods, only for September to bring a staggering $200 billion more into the crosshairs, with rates jacking up over time. China fired back, hitting $110 billion of U.S. goods in multiple waves of revenge tariffs, each volley timed to sting. The plot thickened in May 2019 when the U.S. cranked tariffs on that $200 billion from 10% to 25%, and China retaliated with $60 billion in U.S. goods, a crescendo of economic sabotage that shook the world. Caught in the U.S.-China tariff war were unexpected goods like Christmas lights, dog leashes, and baseball gloves, everyday stuff that somehow landed on the tariff hit list, exposing the bizarre reach of this trade vendetta. These mundane items became silent victims, jacking up costs for regular folks and hinting at a chaotic web of global supply chains no one could untangle. It's a twisted tale of how a policy meant to punish elites ended up snagging the most ordinary corners of life, all under the radar. The tariff strategy didn't stop at China. It ballooned to rope in threats against the European Union, Canada, and Mexico, with steel and aluminum tariffs sparking a multi-front trade brawl that shocked the globe. Soon, the U.S. dangled tariffs over automobiles and parts from Europe and Japan, cloaked as a national security move, rattling industries far beyond the initial targets. This sprawling escalation was no accident. It was a calculated flex of U.S. muscle, rewriting trade rules and leaving allies and enemies alike scrambling in its wake. The threatened tariffs on automobiles from Europe and Japan sprang from a murky U.S. probe claiming auto imports threatened national security, with whispers of 25% tariffs sending shivers through the auto industry. Carmakers like BMW and Toyota panicked, rushing to ramp up U.S. production to dodge the hit, while industry voices screamed about price spikes and job cuts. Yet in a twist, it sparked secret talks for USCU trade deal. This wasn't just a tariff threat. It was a high-stakes chess move, exposing how trade weapons could flip global alliances upside down. Peel apart the Ford F-150, America's iconic truck, and you'll uncover a global supply chain nightmare. Parts from Mexico, Canada, and China that auto tariffs could choke, jacking up costs and stalling production lines. Picture this: an engine from Mexico, a transmission from Canada, electronics from Asia, each piece a potential tariff target, proving even the most American machine isn't safe from this trade war's tentacles. It's a stark expose of how deeply entwined the world's economies are, and how one tariff domino could topple a giant like the F-150. Countries stung by U.S. tariffs didn't sit quiet. They unleashed counter-tariffs with surgical precision, hitting U.S. products like soybeans, pork, and whiskey from China, and Harley-Davidson bikes, bourbon, and peanut butter from the EU. Canada joined the fray with curveballs like tariffs on yogurt and coffee, a sly jab that showed how this retaliation game could turn weirdly personal. These moves weren't random. They were calculated to kneecap U.S. industries and voters, a shadowy ripple of revenge that rewrote the rules of trade warfare. The tariffs tore through the U.S. economy like a double-edged blade. Steel and aluminum makers cheered short-term wins, but agriculture and manufacturing choked on higher costs and lost exports as retaliation bit hard. In a bizarre twist, government revenue swelled from tariff cash, yet it got swallowed by emergency farm subsidies to prop up battered sectors. Meanwhile, inflationary pressures crept up, a silent tax on everyone. This wasn't the economic triumph promised. It was a chaotic unraveling, exposing winners, losers, and a government caught in its own trap. For American consumers, tariffs meant sticker shock. Companies passed on costs, with the Federal Reserve estimating an $831 annual hit per household, spotlighted by tales like washing machines jumping 12% in price. The steel tariffs hiked construction materials, slamming home buyers, while Chinese electronics and toys spiked just in time to ruin holiday budgets, a grim gift from the trade war. These stories peel back the curtain on a policy sold as protection, but secretly bleeding every day while it's dry. Beyond obvious tariffs, companies got sneaky. Shrinkflation shrank product sizes while prices held steady, and quiet price hikes slipped into untariffed goods to cover losses, a corporate shell game consumers barely noticed. Some firms swallowed costs at first, only to unleash broad price jumps later, blaming economic pressures in a move straight out of the conspiracy playbook. Others dodged tariffs by shifting production to new countries, risking quality dips or higher labor costs. Hidden maneuvers that left shoppers paying more, one way or another. The tariffs slammed lower-income households hardest. They burn a bigger chunk of their cash on tariff-hit consumer goods like clothing, electronics, and appliances, a regressive sting the elites brushed off. The Peterson Institute for International Economics crunched the numbers. The poorest 20% could lose 1.8% of their after-tax income, while the richest 20% shrug off a mere 0.3% hit, proof of a rigged game. This unequal burden whispers a dark truth. Trade wars aren't just about nations. They're class wars in disguise, widening gaps the powerful ignore. The tariffs split U.S. industries wide open. Steel and aluminum barons cashed in on less competition. But agriculture, automotive, and technology reeled from retaliation and pricier inputs, while oddball winners like solar panel makers and whiskey distillers briefly toasted niche gains. Farmers, especially Midwest soybean growers, got crushed as China axed their markets, sparking bankruptcies and bailout pleas, an unexpected bloodbath in America's heartland. It's a tale of economic roulette, where tariffs spun a wheel of fortune and despair, revealing heroes and casualties no one predicted. The steel tariffs sparked a fleeting boom for the U.S. steel industry. Think Nucor and U.S. Steel splashing cash on new hires. But dig deeper, and the shine fades with higher costs crippling construction and manufacturing downstream. Imports from non-tariff countries snuck in, undercutting the protection story, while demand swings and trade spats left the boom's longevity in doubt, a mirage of success. This wasn't the steel renaissance Trump sold. It was a messy trade experiment with a twist ending, exposing the limits of tariff magic. In the Midwest, steel tariffs resurrected places like Illinois Granite City Works, pumping jobs into dying towns. But across the tracks, a darker story unfolded as farm equipment makers in Iowa slashed jobs over pricey steel parts. An Ohio construction firm stalled projects as material costs soared, a silent casualty of the same policy that revived steel, a regional tug-of-war no one saw coming. These gritty tales from America's industrial core unmask the tariffs' double game. For every steel win, a manufacturer bled, a conspiracy of trade-offs hidden in plain sight. Manufacturers relying on imported components, such as washing machine producers, stumbled into a tariff trap, while Trump's tariffs on steel and aluminum spiked raw material costs. Tariffs on Chinese parts snarled supply chains, forcing some to relocate production abroad in a twist that undermined the Protect American Jobs mantra. Picture a Whirlpool factory suddenly paying 20% more for steel, only to find their Chinese motors hit with extra duties, a double whammy no one warned them about. This shadowy backfire hints at a deeper game. Were these tariffs really about protection or a chaotic gambit gone wrong? Soybean farmers in the Midwest were blindsided by China's retaliatory tariffs, their golden harvest turning to dust as demand collapsed. Prices plummeted 20% in 2018, driving some into bankruptcy, a bitter pill despite government handouts. Take John Boyd Jr., a Virginia farmer who lost half his soybean market overnight, his story echoing across states as China bought from Brazil instead, a silent act of economic revenge. This wasn't just a trade spat. It was a calculated strike, exposing how American agriculture became the fall guy in a global chess match. Macroeconomic indicators unmasked a messy truth about Trump's tariffs. While U.S. growth faltered under trade tensions, employment became a patchwork of gains and losses, and inflation edged up, a triple threat no one saw coming. The Federal Reserve Bank whispered warnings as GDP growth dipped, jobs swung wildly, and prices crept higher, painting a picture of an economy teetering on the edge. Beneath the bravado, these numbers suggest a hidden cost. Did the tariff architects know the chaos they'd unleash on the U.S.? Despite bold claims of a manufacturing boom, tariffs stumbled on U.S. GDP growth, while steel and aluminum sectors grabbed short-term wins. Higher costs and retaliation dragged the economy down, with studies pinning a 0.2% GDP drop in 2018 alone. The Tax Foundation crunched the numbers, revealing exports tanked $27 billion, a silent bleed masked by the hype of protectionism. This wasn't the promised renaissance. It was a statistical conspiracy showing tariffs as a growth killer in disguise. The job creation myth of tariffs crumbled under scrutiny. While steel mills added a modest 400 jobs by 2019, manufacturing sectors like machinery shed 40,000 positions as input costs soared and farm jobs vanished, a net loss no one advertised. Look at Caterpillar Incorporated, slashing jobs as steel prices bit, while soybean woes axed rural livelihoods, a stark contrast to the jobs galore rhetoric. This paradox screams a cover-up. Were tariffs a job savior or a quiet destroyer dressed up as patriotism? Tariffs lit a slow fuse under inflation, pushing prices up just enough to sting. Tariff goods like washing machines spiked 12% a year, yet broader inflation stayed tame at 2.4% in 2018, thanks to the Federal Reserve's tight grip. The New York Fed pegged the tariff cost at $40 billion annually, a sneaky tax on consumers that eroded wage gains without sounding alarms. It's a delicate ruse. Did policymakers bank on this muted chaos to keep the public in the dark? The global trade system reeled as U.S. tariffs struck. Partners unleashed counter-tariffs, raced to diversify markets, and begged WTO referees for help, a frantic dance to dodge the fallout. From China to Canada, the world rewrote trade playbooks, exposing a web of alliances fraying under pressure no one anticipated. This wasn't just a ripple. It was a seismic shift hinting at a grander scheme. Did Trump mean to redraw the global map? Countries hit by U.S. tariffs didn't roll over. They fought back with precision, weaving tales of economic pain and cunning, from China's bold pivot to Europe's sly countermoves, a gallery of retaliation unveiled. Think EU targeting Harley-Davidson, or China ditching U.S. soybeans, each move a calculated jab to expose American vulnerabilities. These stories peel back the curtain. Trade wars aren't just policy. They're a shadowy battlefield of economic survival. China turned U.S. tariffs into a dare, accelerating its Belt and Road Initiative to snag new markets. Its tech sector shrugging off blows while agriculture buckled under lost U.S. sales. By 2019, Huawei flexed resilience, doubling down on innovation. Yet rural provinces saw soybean imports drop 50%, a split tale of grit and grief. Was this adaptability a secret weapon, or a desperate dodge exposing cracks in Beijing's armor? The EU met U.S. tariffs with a steel fist, slapping duties on Harley-Davidson bikes and bourbon, then twisting the knife to force a 2018 trade truce, a power play that rattled transatlantic trade. German carmakers like BMW lobbied hard, shifting some production to the U.S. to dodge threats. a move that kept exports humming despite the chaos. This wasn't just retaliation, it was a masterstroke revealing how Europe could turn Trump's game against him. Canada and Mexico flipped the tariff script. While Canadian steel raked in $2 billion extra from U.S. demand, U.S. farmers paid more for tariff-hit equipment, a bitter twist amid USMCA talks. Mexico slapped duties on U.S. pork, costing exporters $1.5 billion, yet quietly boosted its own auto parts trade, a sly win under the radar. These neighborly disputes whisper a conspiracy. Did close allies outmaneuver the U.S. at its own game? Currency markets twisted the tariff tail. A beefy U.S. dollar up 5% in 2018 made American exports pricier, amplifying counter-tariff pain, while some nations tweaked rates to soften the blow. China's yuan dipped 10%, easing its export sting, a move some called manipulation to outfox Trump, though evidence stayed murky. This shadowy dance of exchange rates hints at a deeper plot. Were currencies the real weapons in this trade war? Global businesses raced to outrun tariffs, rejigging supply chains in a mad scramble that birthed new manufacturing hubs, a tectonic shift no one saw coming. From Apple shifting iPhone parts to Vietnam, to Ford rethinking its Mexican lines, the world's trade map got redrawn under duress. This supply chain scramble wasn't just survival. It was a revelation of how fragile and cunning global networks really are. The tariffs lit a fire under Vietnam and Mexico, where firms fleeing China sparked a manufacturing boom. Vietnam's exports to the U.S. jumped 40% by 2019, though ports choked and wages spiked. Mexico snagged $35 billion in new factory investments, yet faced trucking snarls and labor shortages, a chaotic windfall from Trump's war on China. This rise wasn't luck, it's a conspiracy of opportunity, exposing how fast the world can pivot when pushed. Behind the tariff curtain, supply chain managers wrestled nightmares. Sourcing new vendors led to delays, like Samsung missing TV deadlines, while rerouting shipments cost retailers like Walmart millions in lost holiday stock. A California tech firm saw lead times double as Chinese parts vanished, forcing a scramble for Vietnamese substitutes that didn't quite fit the bill. These logistical nightmares unmask a truth. Trump's tariffs didn't just hit trade. They broke the backbone of global delivery, one frantic fix at a time. Companies like Apple quietly schemed to outmaneuver Trump's tariffs, shifting iPhone production from China to India and Vietnam, with Foxconn sinking $1 billion into India by 2019 to dodge the tariff crossfire. This long-term relocation wasn't a mere cost-saving ploy. It was a desperate bid to escape a protectionist net that threatened to strangle global supply lines. Behind the scenes, whispers suggest a grander conspiracy. Were these moves proof that tariffs pushed even American giants to abandon their own shores? The U.S. threw a Molotov cocktail into the global trade order, slapping tariffs on steel and aluminum under shady national security excuses, defying WTO rules, and leaving trading partners scrambling to retaliate. By sidestepping the WTO's dispute settlement mechanism, the U.S. didn't just bend the system, it aimed to break it, exposing a fragile international system strain that left smaller nations defenseless. This wasn't trade policy. It was a calculated heist, revealing how one nation could hold the world's commerce hostage. The U.S. tightened its grip on the WTO's appellate body, blocking new judge appointments until it choked out dispute resolutions by December 2019, cementing WTO impotence in a stunning power grab. With the appellate body dead in the water, nations faced a legal vacuum, forced to fend for themselves as the U.S. smirked from the sidelines. This wasn't oversight. It was sabotage, a deliberate strike to neuter the WTO's enforcement power and rewrite the rules of global trade. As multilateralism bled out, countries darted toward bilateral trade agreements, with the EU cozying up to Japan and Canada, while China flexed its regional comprehensive economic partnership muscles. Even the U.S. ditched NAFTA for the USMCA, a half-baked bilateral patch that thumbed its nose at WTO norms, signaling a rise of bilateralism no one could ignore. This shift wasn't just survival. It was a hushed confession that the old trade order was a corpse, and everyone was grabbing their piece of the pie. Tariff wars turned the heat up on U.S.-China relations, with accusations flying like shrapnel, while Europe and Canada fumed at being branded national security threats over steel and aluminum. China spun the chaos into propaganda gold, railing against American bullying, as Trump waved tariffs like a nationalist flag, stoking tensions that smelled more like a geopolitical tensions showdown than a trade spat. Beneath the economic surface, this was a shadow war for global dominance, with trade as the weapon of choice. Global stock markets convulsed with every tariff announcement as investors clutched their pearls over trade policy chaos that could gut corporate profits. Think Dow Jones and S&P 500 roller coasters. Tech stocks and industrial stocks took the hardest hits, swinging like pendulums in a storm of stock market swings that rattled Wall Street and beyond. This wasn't just market jitters. It was a seismic warning, hinting that the unraveling of global trade norms could crash the whole financial house of cards. On March 1st, 2018, Trump's steel and aluminum tariffs bombshell sent the Dow Jones plummeting 420 points, while Europe's stocks 600 shed 1.2%, kicking off an initial market plunge that shook the globe. Then, on July 6, 2018, the U.S. slapped $34 billion in tariffs on Chinese goods, and a Shanghai Composite dove 1.8%, a synchronized nosedive that screamed panic. These weren't flukes. They were orchestrated shocks, exposing how trade headlines could yank markets in a freefall like marionettes on a string. The Dow Jones took a beating when Trump teased tariffs on February 2nd, 2018, crashing 666 points, followed by a 724-point Dow Jones dive on March 22nd as China growled back with retaliation threats. By October 10th, 2018, with trade tensions boiling over, the Dow hemorrhaged 831 points in a day, a bloodbath that had traders whispering about a full-blown trade war. These weren't just dips. They were sirens blaring, signaling a market terrified of Trump's tariff roulette spinning out of control. When the U.S. markets shuddered, the tremors went global. Japan's Nikkei and Germany's DAX mirrored the Dow's tariff-induced flops, tightening a global contagion web during peak trade war fever. On March 23rd, 2018, after U.S.-China tariff volleys, Asian markets buckled, with Hong Kong's Hang Seng tanking 3.4%, a domino effect no one could stop. This wasn't mere finance. It was a mind game, as fear infected investors worldwide, proving trade chaos could poison every corner of the planet. Tariff news lit fuses under technology and industrial sectors, with tech stocks like Apple and Intel cratering over supply chain disruptions, while steel producers like Nucor cashed in briefly amid the sector-specific volatility. Consumer discretionary stocks got slammed too, as firms hooked on imports choked on rising costs. A chaotic split that carved winners and losers with surgical precision. This wasn't random market play. It was a twisted experiment, showing how global trade exposure could make or break entire industries overnight. Tech stocks jittered like a live wire, with giants like Apple sweating bullets over China-sourced parts as tariffs loomed, threatening to jack up costs and stall production in a tech stock tremors frenzy. China could have struck back, targeting U.S. tech firms in its backyard, a retaliatory ghost that kept investors up at night, guessing the next move. This wasn't about earnings. It was a stark reveal of how global tech supply chains teetered on the edge, one tariff away from collapse. Industrial companies played a double-edged game. Steel and aluminum producers like U.S. Steel saw stocks spike 15% post-tariff, while manufacturers like Caterpillar bled 6% from higher input costs, a stark industrial impacts tale. The split was no accident. Tariffs flipped the board, boosting some while sinking others caught in the retaliation crosshairs. This was less about industry health and more about a shadowy reshuffle, proving Trump's policies could crown kings or bury pawns in the same breath. Stocks of consumer goods companies like Walmart and Target twitched downward as tariffs on imports promised price hikes and margin cramps, sparking consumer goods concerns across the board. Meanwhile, some domestic producers smirked, eyeing market share as imported goods got pricier, a subtle shift that could rewrite retail's rules. This wasn't just stock chatter. It was a sneak peek at how protectionism might rig the game, tilting the scales in a quiet conspiracy against the consumer. Endless tariff uncertainty gnawed at investor confidence, driving a stampede to bonds and gold as equity markets sagged under the weight of a grim investor sentiment shift. The VIX, Wall Street's fear gauge, spiked with each tariff escalation, a blinking red light of panic that wouldn't quit. This wasn't a blip, it was a slow bleed, a creeping doubt about global trade and growth that had investors clutching their wallets and praying for clarity. Markets started baking a hefty uncertainty premium into their math, with tariff threats jacking up the cost of capital by up to 1% for exposed firms, a hidden tax on the bold. This showed up in wider credit spreads and shrunken PE ratios, especially in shaky sectors, a financial fingerprint of trade policy uncertainty no one could erase. It wasn't abstract. It was a cold, hard hit, a secret toll that carved chunks out of corporate valuations while the world watched in suspense. During periods of high trade tension, investors often flock to perceived safe haven assets like gold, government bonds, and currencies such as the Swiss franc and Japanese yen. For example, in 2019, as the U.S.-China trade war escalated, the price of gold surged to a 6-year high, reflecting a flight to safety amid whispers of a crumbling global order. This wasn't just panic. It was a shadowy signal that the tariffs unleashed by Trump were pushing the world's wealth into hiding. Meanwhile, algorithmic trading systems, lurking in the digital shadows, likely amplified market swings tied to tariff news. When Trump tweeted about new tariffs on China in May 2019, the Dow Jones nosedived over 600 points in minutes, a plunge fueled by automated sell orders that turned a single post into a financial bloodbath. This wasn't chaos by chance. It was a glimpse of how high-frequency trading could weaponize trade policy into a market-destroying force. As the dust settled, the lasting legacies of this high-tariff era revealed a world forever changed, with global supply chains twisted and trade policy risks etched into corporate minds. Companies like Harley-Davidson and Ford bolted production overseas, a move that outlived the tariffs and hinted at a deeper protectionist plot to reshape commerce. The real lesson? Tariffs weren't just a tax. They were a Pandora's box, unleashing economic nationalism that refuses to fade. Curiously, many of Trump's tariffs lingered like ghosts under the Biden administration, with Section 301 tariffs on Chinese goods still haunting trade routes as of 2023. This wasn't mere oversight. It was a calculated cling to power, fueled by fears of China's trade practices and the political poison of looking weak. The lingering tariffs stood as silent proof that once the tariff trap is sprung, it's a beast no one dares to tame. Why do these tariffs stick? Because policy persistence thrives on vested interests, like the steel producers who turned a small win into a lobbying juggernaut to keep their shields up. It's not economics. It's a political conspiracy where protectionism digs roots so deep that even fading justification can't uproot it, leaving the U.S. economy shackled by its own design. Even now, ongoing negotiations simmer in the shadows, with Trump-era tariffs sparking a US-EU dispute over aircraft subsidies that still taxes French wine and German machinery. Neither side budges, locked in a high-stakes stare-down that smells more like a trade war sequel than a resolution. This isn't diplomacy. It's a lingering echo of Trump's chaos, proving the tariff game never truly ends. Today, the economic debate continues, with most economists sneering that Trump's tariffs bled the U.S. economy dry. Yet some whisper they sparked a fleeting manufacturing employment boost. The real intrigue lies in the clash. Why do these disagreements fester, if not to mask a deeper tug-of-war over economic policy narratives? It's not just numbers. It's a battle for the soul of trade's future, fought with cherry-picked truths. Then came the rethinking of globalization, as the tariff saga forced companies and countries to ditch single-source suppliers and just-in-time inventory for safer bets. Japan dropped $2.2 billion to pull production from China, a move dripping with suspicion that the old global game was rigged. This wasn't adaptation. It was a quiet rebellion, a nationalist rewrite of trade rules that could lock the world into a new, guarded era. The winners versus losers tally paints a grim picture. U.S. steel and aluminum producers gloated over short-term gains, while consumers and manufacturers choked on higher costs, and China slyly dodged the worst with currency tricks. No one truly won. This trade war was a rigged casino where every player lost chips, proving tariffs are less a weapon and more a curse on all who wield them. The scorecard? A dark reminder that victory in trade battles is an illusion. Looking ahead, future policy implications scream for caution. Policymakers must weigh retaliation and global supply chain fallout before swinging the tariff hammer again. The Trump-era tariffs expose unilateral moves as economic self-harm, begging for a multilateral playbook to dodge the next disaster. These aren't just lessons. They're a coded warning from history, daring leaders to break the cycle or repeat the chaos. To unmask the true cost calculation, experts push computable general equilibrium models to tally global value chain damage and retaliation scars before tariffs strike. A 2019 IMF study pegged the U.S.-China trade war as a 0.5% global GDP thief by 2020, a number that whispers of hidden devastation beyond the headlines. This isn't math. It's a secret ledger, revealing how tariffs silently drain the world's wealth. The mess also spotlights diplomatic alternatives, with the USMCA proving trade disputes can simmer down without tariff tantrums, while unilateral stunts just breed tit-for-tat wars. It's no coincidence. Cooperation over confrontation shines as the smarter play. A truth trumps tariffs painfully carved into the global psyche. This isn't policy talk. It's a hushed plea for sanity in a world teetering on trade's edge. Finally, the predictability premium emerges as the holy grail, with stable trade policies slashing uncertainty and boosting markets, a fact the World Bank pinned at a 20% investment boost in 2020 studies. Every tariff twist drove investors to hoard gold and shun stocks, a dance of fear that cost billions in lost growth. This isn't theory, it's the smoking gun, proving Trump's tariff gamble traded stability for a volatile abyss.